Before I get started, I have a couple other housekeeping things I wanted to get let everybody know about. First is level 1 and level 2. We are in the process of finalizing uploading the updated tutorials on our website, and we will hopefully have the exam schedule for 2024. We will have that released by the end of the year. So if you have anyone in your office that would like to take level 1, level 2, we will be updating and loading the 2 tutorials on our website and also getting the exam schedule out by the end of the year. Also, by the end of this week, we hope to have our ratio study guidance out for the assessors, because ratio study is just right around the corner. As Jenny indicated, this is the last webinar for 2023. However, I did want to let you know that in January, specifically Wednesday, January 24th, I will be doing a webinar at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. on the assessor's role and responsibilities. And normally would be the week before, but because of the assessor conference in January, that webinar will be a week later. So pay attention to your emails for a variety of things coming out, ratio study guidance, the exam schedule for level 1, level 2, and then also planning on the webinar in January. So today we're going to talk about agricultural land assessments, and this is probably one of the top 3 or 4 categories of topics that I get questions on, or our staff gets questions on in regard to land assessments. I do have to give a disclaimer that this presentation is not intended as legal advice. This is only an informative presentation. I am not an attorney, so I cannot give you any legal advice. I would suggest or urge you to contact your county attorney if you did have any questions about specific legal matters. And then also, please always refer to the Indiana Code and case law if you have any questions. So today we're going to talk about the review of Indiana Code 6-1.1-4-13. We'll talk about how agricultural land is valued, frequently asked questions. We'll talk about resources, and then at the end, I open it up for questions that you may have. For those of you that have contacted me in the past, a lot of times I will respond, especially in writing, with either an Indiana Code citation or an Indiana Administrative Rule citation. And in the case of agricultural land, the particular code citation is Indiana Code 6-1.1-4-13. And as you can see in paragraph A, I think the key phrase here is the land shall be assessed as agricultural land only when it is devoted to agricultural use. And we'll talk about what are some of those uses here in a minute. So for the agricultural land, you can see that if it's enrolled in a land conservation or reserve program administered by the United States Department of Agriculture, if it's a land conservation program, or if it's something administered by the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, easy for me to say. But also it could be land enrolled in the Department of Natural Resources Classified Forest and Wildlands Program. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the biggest one is coming up as far as land classified and is provided in our guidelines, but primarily we're going to look at land that's devoted to the various topics or areas you can see there. Predominantly, we think of agricultural land and you think of livestock grazing, for example, or the production of products such as corn or soybeans or hay. But it also can include things that the definition has been expanded in the past few years. For example, the bees and apiary products, for example. So there's a lot of things that could fall under the classification of agricultural land. The size of the parcel is not a determinant. That you could have something as small as 1/4 of an acre, for example, that's classified as agricultural land. Typically, when you think of agricultural land, you think of driving on the interstate by farms, and you see, large fields of corn or soybeans being grown, or you see livestock grazing, but the size of the parcel is not a determinant in terms of whether or not it's agricultural property. One of the requirements for the DLGF, the Department of Local Government and Finance, is to make available the United States Department of Agriculture's soil survey data, and then also the appropriate soil productivity factors for each type of soil. And we'll get into that a little bit later. I know we have several Property Tax Assessment Board of Appeals members, PTBO members on the webinar, so welcome. We're glad to have you on board. But all assessing officials and PTBO members shall use the data that we prescribe in determining the true tax value of agricultural land. But one key thing about the soil productivity factors is that these were used, or the ones that were in effect back in 2011. There was legislation that in essence froze or said the soil productivity factors were to remain the same and would not be updated. One of the other key things about agricultural land is it does not apply to land purchased for industrial or commercial uses. So there could be a situation where a taxpayer buys some land and they're going to make it into a factory or maybe an office building or something. So you have to, I'll harp on this throughout the webinar, but you have to look specifically as what is the land currently being used for, and you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. One question that's come up in the past, especially in the past year or so, it seems, is can a taxpayer appeal the agricultural land base rate set by the DLGF? And our response, as you can see, is there's nothing that would prohibit a taxpayer from appealing the value because they object to the agricultural land base rate calculation. But we're not aware of anybody doing that and having any success with that. Like any appeal, it would start at the local level, the county level. And there was only one time in the past where the taxpayer appealed the base rate to the DLGF and then ultimately to the IBTR, the Indiana Board of Tax Review. But that was back in 2002, and the informal hearing was with the DLGF. It was not held locally, and that code provision was repealed in 2007. So if a taxpayer disagreed with the base rate that we set, and we'll talk about how it's set and when it's set, they could appeal it, but I'm not sure how much success the taxpayer would have, because in our calculation, we have a specific code provision that states how we do the calculation of the base rate, and we have to be as transparent as possible. So I'm not sure how or what a taxpayer could appeal the base rate set by our office, but they do certainly have the opportunity or the right to file an appeal if they so desired. So I mentioned bees a minute ago in terms of what could be under agricultural land. So a question came up is there a ratio of bees to acres of ag land? And in this case, we previously had a parcel where the taxpayer was given 1/4 of an acre for bees, but nowhere in the law does it say how many hives he has to have. And we're not aware of any standards per se for bees, but certainly you should only assess that portion of the property, that land that is devoted to the bees and the hives. And as you can see, if the taxpayer disagrees with the land classification or the assessed value, they would have the right to file an appeal. You can see the links there to programs by the USDA's Farm Service Agency, and also programs provided by the USDA's National Resources Conservation Service. All of our land guidance can be found in Chapter 2 of our assessment guidelines. You can see the link on our website to go to Chapter 2. But the land assessment formula basically involves The assessor identifying agricultural tracts using data with detailed soil maps. It could include or use aerial photography and then also plat maps. And in terms of the variables, you certainly look at the size and the parcel's characteristics. The soil maps, and we'll talk about the soil maps, all result in hopefully uniformity in how agricultural land is assessed. Basically, the simplest calculation is for the market value of agricultural land is the net income divided by the capitalization rate, but there's a lot of other components that go into that equation. So I would just urge you, if you had specific questions, to look at our guidelines, not only in Chapter 2, but then also the annual information we get out produced by our office by December 31st each year. One of the biggest questions that we get is, should this land be assessed as residential property or should it be assessed as agricultural property? And the basis, just to point out, is for the two types of land. One is that agricultural land is obviously uses our statewide base rate and the soil productivity system. And then residential land is land that is utilized or zoned for residential purposes, and the residential acreage amount would be determined by the assessing official. If you have a taxpayer that has a farm number, they would be eligible for classification as agricultural land. And I've heard stories in the past of taxpayers going to the USDA to get a farm number just to make sure they qualify, and that's fine. But certainly if a taxpayer does say, here's my farm number, then they would qualify to have their land assessed as agricultural land. As I mentioned a minute ago, parcel size does not factor into whether or not land is assessed as agricultural land, and or whether the parcel is wooded or used for other agricultural activities. As you can see, there are several different types of agricultural land, or how land is identified and how it's assessed, and we'll go into details for each of these. The first one, type 2, is classified land. Then we'll talk about tillable land, non-tillable land, woodlands, other farmland, agricultural support land, and home sites. So classified land is, as you can see, land that has been applied for and approved for specific programs administered by the DNR. A 100% influence factor deduction applies to classified land. And the following table will show you the different types of classified land. So you could have classified forest, wildlands, windbreak, and filter strips. Tillable land, I think, is the most common type of agricultural land that you think of. And as I mentioned, driving on the interstate, you see farms, and you see, cropland that's used for the production of crops such as corn and soybeans or hay, whatever the case may be. But it also could include things like vegetables or orchard crops, or given the current holiday season, it could be used for Christmas tree plantations or nursery plantings. Could also be idle cropland too. In some cases, a farmer may opt to not use their land and have it idle for a season or two. In terms of the different subtypes, we showed the previous classified land. We showed the previous types of land. For tillable land, there's a couple different types of tillable land. The first one is type 42 land, and this is for land that where there's severe or damaging floods occurring 5 times or more in a 10-year period. And if that occurs, then a 50% influence factor deduction applies to the land use type. The next type 43 is farmed wetlands, and this is land that the U.S. Department of Agriculture is designated as farmed wetlands. This applies to land to only areas contiguous land measuring 2.5 acres or more. So that's a key determinant is it 2.5 acres or more, and 50% influence factor deduction applies to this land use type. So basically, you need to look at, I'll keep mentioning it, you need to look at each parcel, each property individually and separately to make a determination on whether or not it meets certain criteria. As you can see, there's the link for both the USDA and also the state offices in regards to wetlands. The next type of property we'll talk about is non-tillable land. And the best way to describe this, I think of it as scrub land or scrub area. And this is land that it's covered with brush or scattered trees with less than a 50% canopy cover, or permanent pasture land with natural impediments that deter the use of the land for crop production. If you have something like this, a 60% influence factor would be applicable. The next type of agricultural land is woodlands, type 6. And this is basically, as you can see, the definition: land supporting trees capable of producing timber or other wood products. This has 50% or more canopy cover, or is a permanently planted reforested area. And typically this is going to be land that is part of the Department of Natural Resources forest program and their guidelines. If you do have something in this area, 80% influence factor would be applied. As mentioned, in terms of the size, a wooded parcel of land less than 10 acres may be assessed, may being the key word here, using the soil productivity method. And we'll talk about the DNR's program in terms of the 10-acre minimum for them, but there could be a situation where a 10-acre tract in terms of woodlands may qualify for the agricultural land designation. I mentioned the farm number program in terms of identifying whether or not it's agricultural land, and also for timber production. Main thing here is seeing, does the land fit in the definition of the Indiana Code citation and/or from our manual and guidelines. One thing you may also want to pay attention to is, if the land is sold, what is the reason for the sale, or what is the land going to be used for? And like anything, everything should be reviewed on an annual basis. Just because one year it's agricultural land doesn't necessarily mean the next year it's going to be agricultural land as well. So the DNR program, the Classified Forest Program, they have a 10-acre minimum for its program. And since it's a DNR program, you'd have to see or refer to their website for specific directions, criteria in terms of their program. But basically it involves the owner showing that they have an active timber management program in place, and also that they have the plan to further enhance the forest quality, and they can show that a regular forest harvest has occurred over a long period of time. So a question has come up is, I had someone file a woodland management program with their office in 2018, and now the ownership has changed. And the question is, can they remove that classification and require the new owner to file a new management program under their name? And the answer is, it depends. And the reason it depends is, if the classification use does not change, it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to file one. If you think the use has changed, then certainly you should require a new plan to be filed. So again, case by case situation, you need to look at the specifics to see, hey, does this meet the criteria or not? And then also you could reach out to the DNR to see if they have any suggestions or concerns about the change in ownership. There are other different types of farmlands, and you can see here type 71 is land used for farm buildings and barn lots. And this does not include the agricultural home site. If you do have this type of land, a 40% influence factor deduction is applied. Type 72 is about land covered by a farm, pond, or running water. So frequently, if you have a farm, you'll see maybe close proximity is a pond or there's running water. If you do have that situation, a productivity factor of 50% or half of the value, and a 40% influence factor deduction would be applied. And this would only be for that land covered by a farm, pond, or running water. Type 73 involves the wetlands that we've talked about. Again, has to be 2.5 acres of contiguous acreage and designated by the USDA as wetlands. If you do have that, a productivity factor of 50% is applied, and then a 40% influence factor deduction on top of that is applied. Type 81 is a legal ditch. And for a legal ditch, this is the area used and occupied as part of a legal drainage ditch. It really has no value, and therefore it's deducted from the total parcel acreage. And you'll see this a lot. Again, if you drive by on the interstate, you see a farm, and you see between the interstate and the farm, you may see a ditch or two. That area is typically going to be used for runoff water. And it's not going to be farmed, but it is there, but it's not going to be accessible. Type 82 land is for a public road, and this is where the right-of-way area is dedicated for a public road, and it's deducted from the total parcel acreage. A key differentiation is the road dedicated? Is it a public road? In other words, is it maintained by the county or the town or the city, or is it a private road? And the taxpayer or the owner is responsible for the maintenance of that road. We had a situation come up in a county where a taxpayer had a farm parcel. They built a house, and in order to get access to the house, they had to put in a road to go over their farm to the land, to the house. Excuse me, got a little choked up about that. And that, excuse me, that land, that road is privately maintained, and it's not a public road. Therefore, in that situation, the public road would be deducted, but the private road would not be deducted. It would be accessible. You may also have land, agricultural land, that's type 83, which is for public utility transmission towers. Typically, this is going to be an eighth of an acre deducted for the parcel acreage for those transmission towers, public utility transmission towers. And as you can see, it's not deducted from the parcel acreage. The last type we'll talk about is the home site. And basically, this is 1 acre per dwelling on an agricultural property is classified as the ag home site land. And that base rate, that rate is determined by the assessing official. It's not used. You do not use our base rate for the agricultural home site. You use information from the assessor based on sales of comparable properties to determine that base rate. Also, a soil productivity factor is not applied to the agricultural home site base rate. There could be situations where you have agricultural excess acreage, and this is land that's presently dedicated to a non-agricultural use, normally associated with the home site. Think of maybe a large manicured yard would be potentially agricultural excess acreage. It would be the same rate that is established for the residential excess acreage category. And again, those amounts are determined by the assessing official. Next area that we're going to talk about are soil maps. And basically, this is where the assessor looks at what are the different types of land in terms of soil. And as you can see, as you would normally think, the more productive the land, the higher its value. And in order to do that, to evaluate and categorize land according to its productivity, you have to use detailed soil maps published by the USDA. And the soil maps show where the different soils are located within the parcel. And it'll also talk about the various soil characteristics. With that comes the soil series, and the soil series basically is a group of soils that are similar in characteristics. And you can see some of the characteristics, what is the drainage, what is the water holding capacity, organic matter content. And each of these soil series has different names. So you may see something named Miami XYZ or Crosby ABC or Fox 123 or Brookston this or that. And it's done for land not only throughout the state, but also the country. So if you saw something classified as Brookston, whatever, it would be that same type of soil could be found in Ohio or Illinois or wherever else that soil might be found. One of the things about the soil series is that when you look at land, there may not be much difference on, say you have a farm, and there may be 2 or 3 different types of soil on that farm, and how or where do you identify or differentiate? And that's something that hopefully you have had or do have on your records, have been there for a long time, that you are able to identify the different soil types. But soil properties, as indicated, or the characteristics, you can see, it helps to estimate what is the productivity of the soil. In terms of when you're defining the soil series, there's a range to account for the variations, but these variations don't greatly affect the productivity of the soil. So in other words, you may have 2 or 3 different types of soils on a parcel, and the productivity factor may be 15%, 16%, 17%, but it's not going to be a huge wide variation, or probably won't be a huge wide variation. So the soil series is then divided into soil map units. And the soil scientists identify the soils, and then they look at the different characteristics in terms of surface texture, slope class, amount of previous erosion, things like that. If you look at a map of Indiana and you look, say, at the northern half of the state, the land in the northern part of the state is probably going to be more fertile than land in the southern half of the state. The land in the southern half of the state may be more clay-based, or maybe more sandy-based, or whatever the case may be. And so that's why we want to make sure we identify the proper soil types, and also have maps that reflect that. So soil scientists will take a look at the plat, take a look at the parcels. They'll maybe use aerial photography to estimate, where is this or that type of soil type. And if there are changes from, one or two different types of soils to another, it's going to be gradual. It's not going to be a drastic situation where you can really differentiate it, dramatically, but it is a gradual change. So what happens, or how do we do the soil productivity index? What occurs with that? Well, you can see there are over 2,400 soil map units in Indiana with productivity rates, and the rating is based on the average estimated crop yields, which basically then say, here's how well the physical properties of the soil work. And some of those properties, look at the slope of the property, drainage, the depth of the rooting, and other soil characteristics. The productivity factors are based on corn yield estimates. And the reason for that is that corn is the major crop, or one of the major crops grown throughout the state. And the corn yields are based on an average level of crop management. And certainly there can be discrepancies in crop management, but it also reflects a 10-year average. And that 10-year average will hopefully account for various aspects of the growing season, specifically the weather. The estimates are done using data from Purdue University and the USDA, and the average level of crop management is assumed to account for variations. Obviously, how much fertilizer does a farmer use, the time of planting, hybrid, that type of thing, that can cause yield differences. So there are a lot of things that are taken into consideration, but as you can see, the soil productivity ratings reflect the yield differences caused by the properties of the soil, not crop management. So in other words, if you have more fertile land, then that soil productivity factor is going to be greater than soil that may not be as fertile due to whatever conditions, be it clay-based or sandy-based, whatever the situation may be for that particular land or that property. The productivity factors do not accurately predict the actual yields, since obviously weather has a great influence on the actual yields, but it's used to say this type of property or this type of soil is more or less productive than others. The highest rating or productivity factor in the state is 1.28%, and the poorest is 50%. So in other words, if the current base rate of $1,900 is used, if you have land that is very fertile, the highest or best performing type of soil, then that $1,900 an acre base rate would be multiplied by 28%, or an increase of 28%. Conversely, if you had soil that was poor and it had a productivity of 50%, you would multiply that per acre $1,900 times 50% to come up with the base value for that particular parcel of land and that acreage. So I had a question come up with this. I have one taxpayer whose family has been farming for years, but the person had no idea about the soil types and the adjustment factors applied for the productivity. He wants to know, where do these factors come from? And so the answer is, it's per the Indiana Code citation. These soil productivity factors are determined by the USDA and also the agronomy department at Purdue. What if you have, and especially in the southwestern part of the state, what if you have strip mine agricultural land? So if coal has been strip mined from an agricultural land, and this was done before December 31st, 1977, I know we're going back a few years, then you would apply a productivity factor of 75%. or in other words, a 25% deduction. If you have land that was strip mined after December 31st, 1977, then the soil ID would have a productivity factor of 68%. So in other words, 32% deduction. We covered earlier the different types of agricultural land use types, and I won't bore you with the names again or the subtypes, but I bring it up because in our guidelines, we do have a chart shows the different influence factors for the agricultural acreage. So as long as you know the land type, you can go in and show or see what the influence factor is, and you can see the influence factors range from a 100% deduction to 0% deduction. So the agricultural base rate for January 1st, 2023 assessment date is $1,900 per acre. And to give you a basis of comparison, for the January 1st, 2022 assessment date, that amount was $1,500 per acre. And the reason I bring that up, we had a situation, unfortunately, with the county recently where the updated assessed value base rate was not applied to all the parcels, and that certainly not only caused an assessment headache in terms of trying to make sure that the taxpayers are assessed fairly and accurately and equitably, but also it's caused a budget issue. And certainly if the jurisdiction is heavily agricultural in nature, that could have an impact on the tax rate and ultimately the tax bill the taxpayers pay. So for assessors, please make sure you update your agricultural base rate on an annual basis. We don't have it done quite yet. Hopefully we'll have the preliminary amount done here by the end of the week, but by December 31st, so 18 days away, we will have the agricultural base rate set out in our memo, and that's to be used for the January 1st, 2024 assessments for taxes payable in 2025. Along with that, we have the classified land rates, and prior to 2016, the classified land rate was $1, and then in 2016, the legislature changed how the classified land rate is calculated, and you can see that the amount has gone from $13.29 an acre in 2017 to the current $15.65 per acre amount. The 2024, much like to coincide with the agricultural land base rate, will be updated, and we will have the classified land rate disseminated by December 31st. So what do you do? How are large tracts of woodland that are not being timbered used for recreation? How are they to be assessed? And again, it goes back to how is the property being used? And is it being used primarily for residential purposes? In other words, is it used for hunting, fishing, recreation, wildlife viewing? Then in that situation, that parcel should be assessed as residential or residential excess acreage. And as you can see, that last sentence is the key, is that remember, use is the key and not necessarily the size of the parcel. What about if you have a large livestock operation? Is that ag land or is it commercial land? And especially if you think of modern day hog and dairy farms. And if you've ever been up in the northwest part of the state, a good example of that might be Fair Oaks Farms. And how would that be assessed? Is it assessed as ag land or is it commercial land? Well, it really again comes back to the land and how it's being used. So where the land where the livestock's grazing in this situation would be certainly assessed as agricultural land. And then you get into Well, what about other parts of that property? What if, it's, a milking barn or something like that? And again, it comes back to the use, and the size of the parcel is not really a consideration. And obviously, be it a big operation or a small operation, you just have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. However, when you get to a situation, you have the land where say the cows are grazing and to produce milk. Well, then what about when that milk then is used to become another product like ice cream or cheese or something like that? At that point in time, that's probably when the the land would be changed over from being assessed as agricultural land to commercial land. Are there any updates or changes for 2024 that we can expect, or has there been any changes we should be aware of? And what is the new per acre ag rate? Well, as I mentioned a minute ago, we will have the agricultural base rate out by December 31st of this year. In terms of 2024, we do not anticipate any changes, but the legislature will be back in session in early January, and there's always the possibility that there could be a legislative change, but that would have to go through the legislative process. So this person inquired, they would like clarification regarding properties that have horses for recreational purposes, and how can that land be designated as agricultural land? And each situation should be reviewed separately. I know if you go to the Indiana Board of Tax Review's website, there are several decisions that address the use of land, and obviously it's a case-by-case situation, but you'd have to look at, is it being used for agricultural purposes, residential purposes, or is it excess residential land? In other words, there's really no clear answer in terms of how to assess that type of land. The law, Indiana code does not indicate that you have to have X number of animals or horses. Is it being used for recreational purposes or 4-H or whatever the case may be? So it certainly is a fact-sensitive situation, and you have to look at each on its own individual basis. Will there be any changes or updates to which factors designate a parcel as agricultural as opposed to residential? We do not anticipate any administrative rule updates, but certainly there could be, it's possible there could be legislative changes. If you think of, for example, this past legislative session, the General Assembly passed legislation in response to the Schiffler decision dealing with the tax caps. So certainly anything is possible, but we do not anticipate any internal changes made as far as our administrative rule process. We are finding it difficult to determine whether hobby farms and or small scale gardens fit the definition of agricultural land, and that's certainly I think a growing area, especially as you see the increase of the number of farmers markets, for example, or people selling produce that they grow, fruit stand or produce stand in their front yard or along the road or whatever the case may be. And so seeking clarity in terms of, is that land, should it be assessed as agricultural land and get the benefit of the agricultural land base rate, or, how should it be classified or, assessed? And I've mentioned it several times, each situation must be reviewed on its own, and it comes back to the use of the property. The key thing is that if the taxpayer disagrees with this assessment, they have the right to file an appeal. One thing we would suggest is be fair and equitable and uniform in your approach, and that might be establishing a standard operating procedure that indicates here's how we assess the property, and here are the criteria we look for. So this next question, my father is a farmer in a county and I'm trying to help him find the answer. What percentage of woods must have tree coverage to qualify that piece of property as woods? So we talked about this earlier on, that it must have at least a 50% canopy cover or is a permanently planted reforested area to get an influence factor. We mentioned also the DNR's classified forest program, and you can see the link there to their website. The key is that it must be at least 10 acres for the DNR's classified forest program. And as a result of that, the land value is reduced significantly for those types of properties. You can see some of the other criteria in terms of the number of trees and the area that's covered. So is the classified forest program something that the assessor automatically does, or how is that handled? Certainly the participation in the program is dependent upon the taxpayer, and it would be up to the taxpayer to enroll in the program, or if they decide to withdraw from the program. So basically the assessor should not be automatically doing anything regarding that classified forest program. It'd be up to the taxpayer. Especially with the number of solar farms that have been coming into being around the state. Have a question about a taxpayer that's maybe trying to find a way to avoid having the solar land base rate not be applied because it's significantly higher than the agricultural land base rate, and they wanted to know, what if a person has livestock grazing or they plant crops between the solar panels? And just because somebody has livestock grazing or planting crops between solar panels does not automatically qualify that area for the solar or for agricultural land. It comes back to what is the primary intended use of the land, and that probably would be commercial and not agricultural. Just having crops or livestock grazing is just a side part of it, and the main intent, the main purpose of the land is to be used as a solar farm. I know a school does not pay property taxes, however, they have farm ground, and if they lease that land out and they make a profit, should they pay taxes? And based on that information provided, then yes, we think that farmland rented out for profit would be taxable in that particular situation. I mentioned before we released the ag land base rate memo by December 31st. It's almost an 80-page document, and it has all of the information you would ever want to know about how the ag land base rate is calculated, where we get the facts and figures from. Then also we have a memo for the classified land as well. So with that, Jenny, certainly open up to any questions we may have received, and also here's my contact information. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and or to your assessment division field rep. So I know we have a few minutes left. So Jenny, any questions?
Yes, we do have a couple. We have, the first one is land use for once used as ag along the roadway, now taken as a right-of-way for fiber optics, still owned by the farmer. What is this use?
Good question. I mean, even though it was, assuming the fiber optics were buried underneath the land, and even though there's a right of way for that land, if it's being used for agricultural purposes, if I were to drive along and see, livestock grazing or agricultural products being grown, I probably would assess that as agricultural land, with the understanding that I know with any right of way, the property owner has to be able to make sure that fiber optics are, available for change or for whatever. But in that situation, I would probably assess that right away as agricultural land. And as soon as I say that, I'm sure the taxpayer is going to appeal and say, well, I can't do anything with the land that goes in the right of way. So again, a case by case situation, but in that, based on the information provided, I probably would go with the agricultural land base rate for that property. Next question.
Great. Our second question is soil better in the north because of the glaciers covered that part, but not southern Indiana?
I'm not a geologist, but yes, that's that's my understanding is based on the, how far the glaciers came into Indiana and the minerals and sediments deposited in the northern part of the state. That yes, that's why the land in the northern part is more fertile than the southern part. Next question.
Yep, I think that answers all the questions. Are there any that you recall from this morning that were different from ones that were asked today that you wanted to share?
Yeah, there are a couple questions from this morning that I thought were pretty interesting. And one of the questions was, in determining, how frequently does the property flood, and should the taxpayer or the assessor be relying on information from FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association, or should they be relying on information from the USDA? And I thought that was an interesting question because certainly if there is flooding or disasters, FEMA is going to have information, and certainly FEMA would have historical information in terms of the flooding and how frequently the property floods if it does flood. But the code provision states that it's to be used or to look at the USDA information, and so I don't know if FEMA and the USDA, if they talk to each other, if they exchange information, or if, no pun intended, if they're in their own silos in terms of sharing or not sharing information. But certainly the FEMA information could be beneficial, but in terms of making the actual determination, certainly I would rely more on the USDA as far as the the information from them to make that determination. Another question that came from this morning dealt with the soil productivity factors and why aren't they changing, and should we do anything with it? And this goes back to 2011. We were in the process of updating our cost schedules, and one of the things we were looking at were the soil productivity factors and updating the soil productivity factors. And at the time, if you remember, we were coming out of the Great Recession from 2007, 2008, and legislation was passed that in essence tried to protect the agricultural land farmers by in essence freezing those soil productivity factors. And so question was raised, do we anticipate the soil productivity factors changing? And the current answer would be no. Certainly there is the possibility, as I mentioned, the legislature coming back in early January, that there could be legislation, but I don't anticipate anything along those lines. But certainly anything is possible. But assessors should be using the soil productivity factors that they have, and should not be using any updated ones. And if you have a question or need a copy of your soil productivity factors, please reach out to me and I'd be more than happy to send you a copy of them. So those were a couple of the main questions I wanted to touch on.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. We don't have any more questions that have been submitted. So if you do have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to Barry. Obviously, his contact information is on there. If you have a question that is not ag related, or you need to get a hold of Barry and you're unable to reach him, just give me a call or send me an email and we'll be happy to get you in contact with the appropriate individual. But want to thank all of you for joining us today at our final webinar for 2023. As Barry indicated at the beginning of our webinar, we will be sending out a schedule for 2024. We hope you can join us at the January assessment related webinar on assessor responsibilities and the role. And also don't forget, you'll get an email that will include the presentation, the video, the CE form, and the survey link. We do appreciate all the feedback that you all provide. It helped us put together the plans for next year. So we definitely do look at those each month in making sure that we are providing those topics that are of interest to our participants. And if you want CE credit, make sure that you get that form completed and submitted to either Donna or your governing body, as well as if you have any CE that you have not yet submitted for this year, please submit that as soon as possible so that we can get that recorded on your records. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you in January.
Happy holidays, everyone.